Indigenous peoples in Latin America have been fighting for their rights for centuries. And today they are still asserting their right to self-determination, land rights, autonomy, cultural preservation, and socio-economic development. Indigenous communities in Latin America have been historically marginalized and discriminated against by the state, and they continue to face many challenges in protecting their rights. Latin America is home to approximately 45 million indigenous people, representing an estimated 500 different ethnic groups. These indigenous peoples have been living in the region for thousands of years, and their rights are protected by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 2007. In Latin America, the rights of indigenous peoples are legally recognized in many countries, including Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Colombia. Despite legal recognition, indigenous rights in Latin America are often violated. Indigenous communities often face displacement from their land due to large-scale development. Projects such as hydroelectric dams, mining, and agribusiness. These projects often have a negative impact on the environment and disrupt indigenous ways of life. In addition, indigenous people are often excluded from decision-making processes and have limited access to healthcare, education, and other public services. The lack of recognition of indigenous rights has led to the erosion of indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. Indigenous languages are particularly threatened, as many are not recognized as official languages. In addition, indigenous communities often lack access to clean water, food, and healthcare, leaving them vulnerable to poverty and malnutrition. In recent years, there has been an increased focus on the rights of indigenous peoples in Latin America. In some countries, governments have adopted laws that recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and provide protection for their land and resources. In addition, there have been a number of successful campaigns to raise awareness of indigenous rights and to protect indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. However, much more needs to be done to ensure that indigenous peoples in Latin America can exercise their rights and live in dignity. Governments must take steps to ensure that indigenous peoples have access to justice, are consulted on matters that affect them, and that their land and resources are properly protected. In addition, governments must take steps to ensure that indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions are respected and protected. In conclusion, indigenous rights in Latin America are still not adequately protected, and indigenous communities continue to face many challenges. The recognition of indigenous rights is essential for the protection of indigenous cultures and for the socio-economic development of indigenous communities. Governments must take steps to ensure that indigenous rights are respected and that indigenous peoples are able to exercise their rights and live in dignity.